So today we're meeting Jesus' first disciples, so the beloved John, who actually we've met before, but also Andrew, who was not only the first evangelist, but probably the first missionary and certainly the first to preach on 3 continents. So welcome to this session, which is Living the Life 2, the Living the Ministry years, and this session is 1.06. And in today's session we're going to be looking at the call of the first disciples, who are named John and Andrew, and exploring who they are. So let's make a start then. Good. So I'm going to start the way we normally do, which is with the text, and we call it the integrated text. But today we're just looking at really 4 verses. I think it's 4 verses, and it's all from John, so not that integrated. But if you add them all together, we're putting them all into chronological order. So remember we looked the last time, which I did before Christmas. I've had a couple of weeks off, but we looked at how John the Baptist had testified to Jesus that he was the Son of God, he was the Lamb who took away the sin of the world, and so on. And we read in that context that then the 2 disciples heard him speaking. So they've heard John saying those things, they've heard him pointing to Jesus, and they followed after him. So this is verse 34, John 1:34. And Jesus turned and saw them and asked them, said, "What do you want?" And so they said to him, "Rabbi," which translated is teacher, "where are you staying?" So I just want to draw a couple of things out of here. Well, actually, let's read the whole passage first, and then we'll do it. So he replied, "Come and see." So they went and they saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, and it's about 4 p.m, the 10th hour. And then Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, was one of the 2 who had heard John and followed him. And he first found his brother Simon and said to him, "We found the Messiah," which is translated Christ. And that really, it's the verse before that is where I'm running up to, but I want to give some context with that last verse. So we have a very simple introduction here in John's Gospel, and these are the first named disciples. I say named because only one of them gets named, of course. That's Andrew. And so as a result of being the first named disciple, he's often called the first called. And he's a significant character, as we're going to see. We're going to look at some things which you probably won't have seen before about Andrew, because they had drawn from ancient documents rather than from the text of the Bible itself. So they're not the same as Scripture, but there's no reason to disbelieve them all, if I can put it that way. And they all tell a very consistent picture about Andrew. So we're going to look at that in a bit. But then there's this other character who's with him, who's not specifically named, who creeps their way right the way through this Gospel of John, who's referred to as the beloved disciple. And the beloved disciple's name undoubtedly was John. I know there's a lot of kind of confusion. People say, "Oh, you don't know," because it never says it in the Gospel. But in the ancient world, documents were held in libraries, private libraries. So in other words, your own bookshelves. You organise things according to the author. So the author's name's important. Now, there is a habit in the ancient world of what they call pseudo-epigrapha, which is you stick somebody else's name on the book to kind of get it credibility. But actually, for that to work, you need a large gap, 100+ years between the actual real author dying and somebody pretending to be that person. And it's much harder to believe it, although there are people who do, but it's much harder to conceive it when things are really tight and close to the times when the real person's around and doing something. And so it doesn't really make sense. It may have made sense back in the days when people were saying that John wasn't written for 150 years till after Jesus' resurrection. The tubing school and so on, if you go back and look at some of those old sessions that we did. But it doesn't really work when you realise that actually we have scraps of John that go right the way back to the beginning of the 2nd century, and the eyewitness details that have been established in John's Gospel have been very difficult for someone to know later than kind of a few years after Jerusalem is destroyed, for instance. So we don't take that long-term view of John, in which case we have to say if John's Gospel has always been known as John's Gospel, it was written by someone called John. So we have 2 disciples, one who's not named, but we know his name is John, and Andrew. And in kind of keeping with the structure of the Gospel, what we actually discover is that at the end of the Gospel, so there are here we have the beloved disciple,
and Andrew, and then Andrew's going to introduce Peter. That's what we're going to do in the coming weeks, and then we're going to meet Nathaniel and Philip. See, now it's interesting because we meet all of those characters at the end of John's Gospel. John chapter 21, Peter is there. Actually, with the exception possibly of Andrew, as we'll see in a second. Andrew is there. Thomas is there, we don't meet at this occasion. But he's mentioned. Philip, who we do meet, is there. Remember, they're at the beach. They've been fishing at night. They see someone on the shore and they realise it's Jesus. And they come to him and Jesus prepares breakfast for them. And this is the end of John's Gospel. So Peter is there. James and John are there, the sons of Zebedee. So there's a John who's present there. Thomas, as I mentioned. Nathaniel is there. I don't think Philip is mentioned anyway. But anyway, and then it talks about two unnamed disciples. And actually it's interesting, two unnamed, because Andrew isn't mentioned and named there. But actually, but it could be Andrew and Philip. And that would make some sense because it's very, very kind of common in the way you set things up. It wasn't a kind of strict rule, but it was very common in ancient writings. You establish your credibility. You introduce people at the point that they become an eyewitness, which is what I think the author is doing here for himself and for Andrew. He's saying we were eyewitnesses right from the beginning, and then at the end you kind of refer back to them to see. So they've been eyewitnesses right the way through this period. And so in that kind of a context, we kind of seem to that. We've established something, and then at the end of John's Gospel we get that little phrase about and we all confirm this is true. And I just want to kind of draw this out. I don't want to spend too long because we've done it in other sessions, but we know from Papias, who's captured for us by Eusebius, I'll just read what he says. If by any chance, and Papias lived from 60 to about 130 AD, so he's born within kind of 30 years of, so within a generation of the church starting. He says, if by any chance anyone who had attended on the elders, i.e. the first generation of the church, the elders, should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders, or Andrew, or Peter, or Philip, or Thomas, or James, or John, or Matthew, or any of the other of the Lord's disciples, and whatever Aristian and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying. And here in Eusebius, capturing Papias, he's actually introduced to us potentially two Johns, because there's James or John, and then there's someone who he refers to Aristian or the elder John, and we find the elder John in these kind of lists of things like the 72, and it does seem there's another character called John. And so when we're thinking about John's Gospel and these two characters who are there at the beginning, one of whom becomes known as the beloved disciple and is clearly the author of the Gospel, we know their name is John, but are they the disciple or are they the elder who was one of the 72, etc., etc.? And I vacillate. Some of you will know. I like, it could be John the Apostle. And Irenaeus, who's one of the first, one of the early church fathers, writing before Eusebius, although Eusebius is quoting Papias, who predates Irenaeus. Irenaeus says that John the Elder and John the Apostle were the same person, and he ought to know, because Irenaeus was a disciple of a guy called Polycarp, who was himself. He was a disciple of, I think he was directly a disciple of John the Apostle. So you'd think he would know. It is possible to kind of get things confused, particularly when people share a name. And interestingly, if people are going to get confused, it's very often because they are part of almost a unit, if I can put it that way. And that might be what's going on here. I'm just going to share some thought, not as if you like gospel truth, but as I try and hold this tension, because I can see benefits to when you're kind of harmonizing the Gospels, to John the Gospel writer being John the Apostle, who it seems is Jesus's cousin, a younger cousin, who shares a mother, Salome, who is the sister of Mary, and we get that from a Protestant tradition by comparing the lists of the women at the cross. We've done that elsewhere. In fact, if you look in, I think in the series I've done on the last week, we kind of explore some of that. So there's some benefits to, if you like, in harmonising the Gospels, to understand the Gospel writer as John the Apostle, and that's the simple way. But there is also some problems because, for instance, remember when Peter and John get arrested, it's referred, and they stand before the Sanhedrin, it says they're not educated. And yet John's Gospel is incredibly well written. It does look like it's written by someone who's reasonably well educated. Now, it's possible it is just a kind of a way of saying they didn't go to the right universities, they weren't stupid. That's totally possible. But they're not seen as being kind of classically trained. We kind of see something of the tension that the writer, he uses a couple of phrases here. Talks about, I think I just read it. So it says, they said to Jesus, Rabbi, which in translation means teacher. So he's clearly Jewish, but he knows he's writing for a Greek audience, and his Greek is very good in John's Gospel, and his theology is very good as well. You could say, well, we may be looking for someone a bit more educated. Well, if we kind of take the traditions a little bit deeper and kind of, I've done these before, so I'm not going to spend too long on them. The Moratorian Canon, which is, we have a copy of it from the 7th century, but it goes back to the 2nd century. It tells us that the fourth of the Gospels is that of John, one of the disciples, and to his fellow disciples and bishops who had been urging him to write, he said, "Fast with me for these 3 days, and it will be revealed to each one of us, and we should tell it to the other." In other words, what he's saying is we should do something collaborative. So let's do something collaborative, and we're going to pray about it. But that same night, so as they start to pray and fast, it was revealed to Andrew. So Andrew is there. Okay, it's interesting because Andrew comes here into the text right at the beginning of John's Gospel. So John is there in the mix. It seems that in the context of this, that perhaps Peter, because if Andrew is taking the lead here, perhaps Peter seems to be missing. There's no reference to him. So it's thought that this is probably happening after Peter's execution in the early 60s, and probably Paul's as well, and then perhaps that's what's prompted them to say, well, we want to capture another take on the story of Jesus. We have one, it's produced 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, but they all follow the synoptic, the same perspective, which was the official perspective of the Jerusalem apostles when being headed up by Matthew, working together, and he kind of sets a framework, and everyone's worked within that framework. But now, as we're getting to the point where we're going to start to lose the witnesses, what we want to do is capture a new gospel, not a new gospel in that sense, but a new account of the works of Jesus. And so they work together. And so Andrew says that he thinks John should write it down in his name, and they should all review it. So you get the sense of there was something that was going to be cooperative, and then it gets reduced and it's written by one person. But there is a kind of a strong sense in which that one person is perhaps drawing in the perspective of the others, and then they're going to kind of finally come and review it. And so there is something of others' perspectives in the mix. It's kind of interesting as well that John's Gospel at least twice kind of references the fact that there are other perspectives on the Gospel. He talks about... because we get this final statement at the end of John. This is the disciple who testifies about these things and has written these things. This is how the gospel concludes. And then it says, and we know his testimony is true. So that we here is what the Moratorian Canon is referring to, those who still survive, those who are still around. Headed up by Andrew. So Andrew's kind of invisibly there as probably the person who signs the we. And there were many other things that Jesus did, and if every one of them were written down, I suppose the whole world wouldn't have room for the books that would be written. It's kind of almost a testimony to this statement. They were all going to contribute, but it got reduced a bit, although maybe the author, John, drew in some other perspectives, but we didn't try and get everybody's story of Jesus, but we consolidated it through the mouth of John, the gospel writer. And then you go on, I think I've got another, oh yeah, that's right, of course, in John 20, just the chapter before, it says Jesus performed many other miraculous signs in the presence of the disciples which are not recorded in this book. Again, it's kind of referencing part of that canon, the Moratorian Canon's kind of statement is they all would have had stories, and we haven't got them in. We're acknowledging that, but we're endorsing what has been written. It's kind of the way it works. But in that mix, was it I wanted to draw out? Yes, is then John? Which one is he? We also know there's a testimony to say that John, it seems to be is writing from Ephesus. So in fact, I've got the quote. So by Polycrate, who's defending the date of Easter, he tells us a little bit more. He tells us that he's drawing on those who've lived and died in Ephesus to kind of say, we understand these things. And he's arguing about the date of Easter. And so he says Philip was one of the 12, and he's listing the credentials of those he can draw on to say, well, we've got it right. And John too, who leant back on the Lord's breast, and who was a priest wearing the sacerdotal plate. He was both a witness and a teacher, and he's fallen asleep at Ephesus. And Polycarp too. So Polycarp here is kind of saying, we've got the testimony of John, who wrote the gospel, and he was a priest. Well, we never read that of the disciple John, the apostle John, but that doesn't mean he's not. And we do know, and if he is a relative of Jesus, we also know that Jesus is very closely related to a priestly family, because John the Baptist is a close relative. And John is from Zechariah and Elizabeth, who are both descended from Aaron. You see, so we know that. So we know that they're kind of close in. So he could be John the apostle, could be the priest. But what's interesting is that the phrase beloved, because we know that the gospel writer John refers to himself as the beloved disciple all the way through. It can't just mean someone with familial who you have kind of familial affection for. So that's one of the meanings. If you go and look, this is the Hebrew use of it. If you go and get your get a concordance out, you'll discover, and you look at the word Daud, which we get the name David from, which means beloved, and you'll see that very specifically when it's applied to a family member, it normally means uncle, and that's interesting. So is the beloved disciple actually technically an uncle of Jesus? Well, Jesus had a cousin called John the Baptist, whose name was new in his family, so it didn't go back a generation before that. But it's always possible that from a kind of strict familial kind of point of view, you can have an uncle who's younger than you. I have a friend that's a church minister who's just recently had a child who is younger than several of his grandchildren. Those things happen, don't they? So it is always possible you can have an uncle who's kind of a bit younger than you. So it's always possible that someone was born within Jesus' wider family circle who's named after John the Baptist. Now, I'm speculating. I'm just wanting you to kind of get a feel for the kind of closeness. But I do see in that word beloved that there is a kind of a hint of something familial, something to do with family in it. If you go and look at the use of the word in the Old Testament, because remember that the writer of the Gospel, those writing in Greek, is writing from a Jewish perspective. That's why he said translated like this. So I kind of resolve these things in my head. I hold it, well, I'd quite like it to be John the apostle. That works in certain ways. But if it's not, it's probably within the family. There's probably some sort of family connection, and that's perhaps why the two get a bit confused, which is perhaps why in Ephesus there are two places that are supposedly where John's tomb is, because perhaps there were two Johns, John the elder, John the disciple, and that John, whoever wrote the gospel, was writing on behalf of others, and all of those sorts of things. So you kind of get that little bit of a perspective coming in. So that's John. But I want us to think about Andrew, because he's one we think about less. Before we do, I didn't draw it out, but actually in those words, they followed Jesus and said to him, Rabbi. And there's a very strong implication in that. We often don't feel it, that Jesus already has disciples. Now we know from Acts that, I'm just hoping that, yeah, it's still going. We know from the book of Acts, that that all of the disciples meet Jesus under the ministry of John the Baptist. And here it sounds like there were some already, they're just not named. And the reason for that is because in one sense what the gospel writer is doing is establishing his eyewitness credentials, and he's including Andrew in that, who becomes the sign-off, you see. So he tells the story of how they come in, but there are others there already. Jesus is acting as a rabbi within the ministry of John the Baptist. So anyway, where have we got to? Let's kind of keep going. Oh, that's, yeah. So Andrew, yeah. So what do we know about Andrew? Well, Andrew is one of those kind of fascinating characters. He's part of a team of 4. If you compare the lists of the disciples as they appear in the Gospels and also in the book of Acts, they're always grouped in 3 groups of 4. So Andrew is part of the group that's Peter and Andrew, James and John. But very often when you're reading the Synoptic Gospels, you hear about Peter, James and John, Peter, James and John, Peter, James and John. You think, why isn't Andrew there? Well, I have a theory. I think sometimes he was there, but he doesn't get mentioned. And the reason he doesn't get mentioned is that Andrew actually is presented here in John's Gospel as the first evangelist. He goes and gets Peter and brings him to Jesus, the first person to go and find someone and bring them to Jesus. And actually within church history, Andrew is also the first missionary. He's not Paul. He beats Paul miles ahead of things. He is the most prolific and earliest missionary evangelist. But we don't read his story in the book of Acts. Well, because the book of Acts is written by Luke, who commissions and sends out Paul, and it's probably written as part of Paul's defence in Rome before Nero. So it focuses on Paul's journey rather than Andrew's. But we know from the early church that Andrew did a huge amount. And when I say from the early church, it's not kind of pure fantasy. It's what we call legend rather than total fake, total mythology. It's not the mythology of Andrew. It is kind of legend. But in this kind of context, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Yeah, there's a huge amount of evidence which has been put together, and I've got to. Unfortunately, I was going to say the person who did it. See if I can find where's his. Yeah, I've actually printed them out because I will never remember the list, and I'll try and do this a bit more interestingly. We'll do it graphically. I'll put a map up when I edit this. But a guy by the name of George Alexandru, who's an investigative journalist, and he's a contributor to a theological, Greek Orthodox theological magazine, the Emmaus Road. Did a huge amount of work, and he's published it, but unfortunately it's in Greek, so it doesn't really help. And I managed to track down selections of it on the internet and so on, and so I've included some of the kind of his summations, but I can't give you the details, which is not the point of this anyway. But he's traced Andrew's journeys, and he kind of, as he presents it, he says that they are remarkably consistent in that although they come from various source locations and so on, they actually create a pattern that follows trade routes, and you know that there were churches there from very early on and so on. So there's lots of circumstantial evidence. And it's a bit like some years back now, I had the opportunity of teaching in Albania, and I got taken to a town, I can't remember where it was, which is apparently where Paul landed when he came up on one of his trips. And there the local Orthodox Church has family records that go all the way back to the generation of Paul. Now, you can't verify them because they're the only documents that have those people's names in that go back that far, but why would you fake it? So it looks like their church records there, they remember the names of the families, the first families that got saved by Paul. So he said, we don't include it as scripture because it's not in scripture, but actually the tradition is good. It may be legend, and you might get some things embellishing it, but at the heart of it, there's some truth, you see. So he gathered all of this copious amount of work, copious stories all over the place, and fitted them together into a timeline, and they are remarkably consistent in terms of trade routes and so on, and they do fit together very well. And so just for kind of fun, I thought we would kind of just have a quick look at them in the broad sense, not a detailed sense, because we often miss these things about the characters, and as we do this, I wanted to understand some of the people involved. So it seems that Andrew goes on his first missionary trip within a year or so of the resurrection, which would make sense because this is the point where Matthew is starting to shape what becomes Matthew's gospel by publishing stuff there. And if he's no longer in the area, it's got new converts coming in, and they're writing a story, and they're getting a story, and it says Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And Andrew's just a headache to mention because nobody knows who he is, nobody's seen him because he's not there. So what actually happens is it seems initially he goes out into Samaria and Judea, but very quickly he goes down to Greek speakers in Gaza. And it's interesting because Andrew's name is a Greek name. And you say, well, okay, so Peter's name is Cephas. Oh, sorry, it was Simon. Simon Peter, his brother is Simon, which is a Jewish name, but he's called Andrew. But Galilee is Galilee of the Gentiles, as Isaiah calls it. It's heavily influenced by Greek culture. And so it seems that the family is very comfortable in kind of Greek culture. They called one of their sons a Greek name, Andrew. But it's interesting that is Andrew then, who at the end of Jesus' ministry in the final week, there are some Greeks that come looking to meet Jesus. They go to Philip first, who also has a Greek name, which probably means he's a Hellenized Jew, which means he speaks Greek well. So they talk to him. Oh yeah, I can talk to you. And he then takes him and joins him with Andrew, because presumably Andrew, from a fishing family that's conversant and trades into Greek and speak Greek well as well as speaking Hebrew well. Philip actually introduces them to Andrew, and Andrew introduces them to Jesus. And here we have this situation where we got the Greek-speaking Philistines in Gaza, it is Andrew who goes to them in about 34 AD, 34, 35. And then from there he kind of heads up to Lydda in what later became Palestine under the Romans. Then he goes on to Ankara and then to Edessa. And in Edessa, which is in Turkey, of course, he leads a guy called Abgar, who's the king of the region, to Christ. And Abgar declares his nation a Christian nation, and that's only 35 to 36 AD. This is the world's first Christian nation, and they're led to the Lord through the work of Andrew in 35 to 36. He then goes on from there and up into Byzantium, which then of course becomes Constantinople, and he plants the church there, and he has with him a guy called Stakis, who we're told is one of the 72. The Greek Orthodox Church remembers him as that, who becomes the bishop there because he moves on from there. So he leaves Stakis behind, and then he goes on from there, and he kind of works his way across the top of Turkey, Bithynia, Cappadocia, Galatia, not the same part of Galatia that Paul goes to, is the more northern part. And he gets to Pontus, which is in northern Turkey, and then we're told he goes into Georgia, Armenia, and then he returns down to Jerusalem, and he's done all of that by 39 AD. So for that period where Matthew's first coming into being, it's not yet written, but it's kind of shaping, and the stories are being told. The stories are kind of probably being told with very scant reference to Andrew, which is perhaps why we don't read about him, although he's part of the same group of four. We don't read about him in the same way as we read about the other three. So anyway, he then starts another trip, and he starts the second trip in a very kind of similar way to the way he does his first kind of missionary trip. So he goes up to Antioch, which he's been to before. It's a Syrian Antioch rather than Antioch in the kind of Turkey area, where the Christians are first going to be called Christians. But then he kind of turns out and goes to the sea and picks up a boat, and we're told he's heading up to Ephesus, where he's going to meet up with a John. Which one we don't know. It's before the church in Ephesus is being planted. We don't know why he's going there at this stage. But we're also told that they have to stop at Cyprus to pick up fresh water, and actually that's why in Cyprus you've got the Cape of St Andrews, apparently, where he lands to pick up fresh water. But he then goes on up into those kind of areas of Turkey, and he kind of works his way back round to a similar sort of route to the first trip, onto Georgia. But when he gets to Georgia, then instead of heading back to Jerusalem, he seems to drop down towards Pakistan through Persia, through Kurdistan, and he gets to what's modern day we refer to as Balochistan, the desert of Gedrosia, which is on the Pakistan-Iranian border today. And there he meets a group of people who we read about in other texts, in the not biblical text or anything, just in historical text, the kind of Kephaloi, which means the dog-headed or dog-faced, who are apparently a group who used to mutilate themselves by cutting their mouths, so you can see the teeth right round the side. And apparently he has a kind of remarkable experience in leading to the Lord, and they seem to change their appearance, which fits what we know from elsewhere, which probably just simply means, because we have this kind of cryptic statement about how they change their appearance after you've been there, and that's probably means they stop mutilating themselves. Anyway, he heads back. Sorry, he doesn't just head straight back. From there, he seems then to head through top Pakistan and Afghanistan along the Silk Road, right the way to the western part of China, and then kind of starts to circle around the kind of region that's the kind of northwestern end of China and up into kind of the beginnings of what we think of as Russia today. And actually we can find there are three totally separate traditions about the journeys he's doing there, but they actually fit together very well, and they're all totally independent. So you have three kind of independent sets of legends in the churches in that kind of that sort of region that touches on to Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and up in towards the southern parts of Russia. and they're maintained in three different kind of church traditions, ancient early church traditions. Anyway, from there he kind of seems to circle up into Russia. You got loads of villages and so on where he seems, the stories are that he's come in that first trip. He almost gets murdered in Kurdistan as he's returning, but he eventually gets back to Jerusalem about the time of the Jerusalem Council, which is interesting that he's back at that stage. And so he would have something to say about Gentiles becoming Christians, but how he's doing it we don't fully know, because we don't have the records like we have of the church of Paul's journey. But he would have something to say on that account. And then there is a tradition that we take seriously because which is maintained by the Ethiopian church, the Ethiopian Coptic church, that he comes into Africa, which doesn't fit his usual pattern. The story is that there's some issues to do perhaps with Matthew being captured by some people and him coming down or whatever. But the reason why it's taken seriously by this guy, Alexandra Giorgio, whatever his name was, I said, put it up on the board, put it up on the screen. The reason we take it seriously is because the geography kind of seems to fit, in that it refers to, let me just see what's the, which kind of, it fits Tanzania, Uganda, Congo kind of area, the Great Lakes area, because it makes, that's right, it makes reference in there to going to the land of Anthropophagi, which is a definite place. It's quite a large area which covers all those places I just said. But further, there's a reference to a volcano which would probably locate it somewhere near Lake Kyoga, apparently. So it kind of, because of those geographic elements that fit together, we take it seriously. But it seems to just be a short trip, and it would fit in, say, around 50, just after the Jerusalem Council. He kind of goes down, does some things, heads back. And then from there, he sets off on his kind of major final missionary journey, which kind of, again, pushes into the same route, the east and north. So east and north. So he heads out again. He goes up to the Sea of Oz, which is in southern Russia. Then he pushes up further into Russia through Crimea, gets up to Kiev and Ukraine. And then he kind of starts to circle around, comes back down, and eventually kind of seems to be passing through Romania, where he seems to spend an awful lot of time. There seems to be a period of around 20 years where he's staying in different caves and so on, and there are lots of shrines and traditions about where he stayed and so on in that region. And that seems a bit like Paul centers himself in Ephesus after lots of journeys. Romania seems to be the kind of the location, and from there he seems to operate out. Now within that mix, obviously he's come back and he's met with the other disciples, and that's what's commissioned John's Gospel. And eventually he's martyred, but he's probably not martyred until 95 to 105 AD. George Alexandru, the guy I've been mentioning, he actually thinks that Andrew is the last living apostle. He puts it at the later end, after John. So there's nothing, of course, in Scripture that says John was the last to die. We've just often assumed that from the Western Church. And as an Orthodox writer, he takes the view it's actually Andrew, and puts it around those dates. And so, of course, he's martyred by being put on an X-shaped cross because he, like Peter, doesn't want to be executed in exactly the same way as Jesus. So that's Andrew, the first evangelist. And so we kind of, as we just draw these kind of collections, we've only taken 4 verses, but spent a long time on them. You see how they set things up. These are key eyewitnesses, John and Andrew. John is the eyewitness, and he's going to be there at the end. And Andrew sets a tone for evangelism, and that probably at the time that John's Gospel is being commissioned was, of course, right at the heart of what they're doing. It's why they're taking the Gospel with them. And Andrew has already proved himself by the time of its writing as an incredible model, and so he kind of captures and names him as the first disciple, even though at this point Jesus as a rabbi has other disciples, so maybe some of the others are there already, they're just not mentioned. And so Andrew ends up with the title first called. Is it something like proto-ectelion or something like that? I've got it wrong, I'm sure. I'll look it up and stick it on the screen. Which is as a title in both the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox Church. He's the first called, and of course he is the first evangelist, not just in the Gospels, but actually also in terms of missionary work. And so next time we'll kind of get back by looking more traditionally at the biblical text. We're going to just look at the calling of Peter. So I'm going to leave it there for now and say hopefully it's been helpful. Remember, you can download notes and you can download the text we've used, even though it's only a few verses. Also, please pass these on. If you haven't subscribed at this stage, it's really helpful if you do subscribe. That'd be fantastic. So until next time, I'll say goodbye. But yeah, I hope you've got something out of today's session. Thanks then. Bye bye.